avoid accountability simply by refusing to allow international investigative missions into the country and rejecting their requests for cooperation. This appears to have been Myanmar's strategy in this case. It should not be rewarded for its obstructive behavior. Myanmar's second argument is that the court's reliance on the FFM, IIMM, and other reports submitted by the Gambia would be what they call an abnegation of its judicial function because it would amount to a, quote, delegation of its fact-finding responsibilities to other non-judicial entities. They're wrong about that, too. We say when the court receives, reviews, and decides to accord evidentiary weight to the report of an independent and authoritative United Nations body, that is a legitimate exercise of its fact-finding responsibility, not an abnegation of it. We are supported in this by the long line of cases I reviewed earlier, in each of which the court determined, upon its own analysis and according to its own criteria, that such reports were reliable and should be accorded due evidentiary weight. Myanmar reads these cases selectively and draws a different, we say, erroneous conclusion. They say the case law establishes that the court may rely on third-party findings only when they result from judicial proceedings, like the findings of the ICTY cited by the court in Bosnia and Croatia, or from judicial-like proceedings, like the findings of the Porter Commission in DRC v. Uganda. They completely ignore the court's reliance on the Secretary General's report in Bosnia, the Special Rapporteur's report in Croatia, and the reports of the Secretary General and the Special Rapporteur, among others, in DRC v. Uganda. Nor do they have an answer for the court's reliance on the reports of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the CERD Committee in Ukraine v. Russia. Myanmar's argument not only runs counter to the court's jurisprudence and longstanding practice, it also misperceives how the court necessarily conducts its business. The mission of the court to resolve disputes is to resolve disputes peacefully between states in accordance with international law. It is not to determine guilt or innocence of individual perpetrators or impose sentence on them. That is the role of the International Criminal Court, which is a criminal court empowered to deprive the accused of their liberty and property, must afford them their due process rights to directly confront and cross-examine the witnesses against them. Those are not judicial function determines are entitled to evidentiary weight. It would be impractical and serve no higher purpose for the rules of criminal procedure to be imported into the ICJ. In this case, it is not disputed that the FFM reached its factual findings after interviewing more than 1,200 victims and witnesses from scores of Rohingya villages where the clearance operations were carried out. If the court could not make findings of fact without hearing the testimony of these witnesses firsthand in the Peace Palace, in a situation where there have been no prior prosecutions by a war crimes tribunal, how many of them would it have to hear to find that the clearance operations were carried out with a similar modus operandi in at least 54 different villages, as the fact-finding mission concluded? that extreme brutality and sexual violence were inflicted in all of these villages, that nearly 200 Rohingya villages were burned to the ground by the Tatmadaw. From how many witnesses would the court have to hear to determine what happened in a single one of these villages, let alone scores of them? In cases of mass atrocity or injury, be it by genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or cross-border environmental catastrophe, hearings involving examination, cross-examination, and redirect examination of the requisite number of witnesses would occupy the court full time for several months at least. The effect of Myanmar's effort to put a straitjacket on the court in regard to its ability to rely on investigative reports by UN and other authoritative bodies would be to make it all but impossible for the court to hold a state accountable under the Genocide Convention, absent the state's prior submission to the jurisdiction of a war crimes tribunal, an effect which Myanmar apparently does not find inconvenient. I think we can safely assume that it has no intention of subjecting Senior General Hwang and his accomplices to such proceedings. There is no benefit in the approach Myanmar urges you to take. It is true that this court is uniquely a court of first as well as last instance. But why shouldn't the court, in its wisdom and when the circumstances warrant, continue to rely on convincing evidence responsibly and reliably obtained by independent, impartial, and authoritative third-party entities, especially other organs of the United Nations, in making its findings of fact? If the court determines, to quote from its July 2024 advisory opinion, that, quote, the care taken in preparing a report, the comprehensiveness of its sources, and the independence of those responsible for preparing it are such as to ensure reliability and to warrant evidentiary weight, why should the court be precluded from treating it as such? We say, far from an abnegation